We often think globalization began with the internet, maybe with shipping containers, or international trade deals, or fast food chains popping up on every continent. But what if globalization didn't begin in the 20th century? What if it began thousands of years ago, with silk, with spices, with empires hungry not just for land, but for reach? Because while today's world is more connected than ever, the idea of a connected world? That's ancient. And the story of how we got here isn't just about economics. It's about conquest, curiosity, exploitation, and survival. This is the real origin story of globalization. Long before nations had flags or passports were stamped, humans moved. For food, for shelter, for salt, for obsidian. Trade routes formed organically, winding through deserts, scaling mountain passes, crossing rivers that once divided civilizations. Around 3000 BCE, Mesopotamians were already trading with the Indus Valley. Gold from Nubia made its way into Egyptian temples. Jade from China found its way into Olmec tombs. These weren't isolated empires. They were early nodes in a growing web. A web that stretched across cultures, languages, and geography. Goods moved, so did ideas, and so did diseases. Globalization had already begun, just slowly, quietly, by camel and by canoe. Fast forward to around 130 BCE. The Han Dynasty in China opens trade with Central Asia. What follows is the birth of the Silk Road, though it was never just one road. It was a network, a living organism of routes that stretched from Xi'an to the Roman Empire. Silk went west, gold went east. But also, paper, gunpowder, religion, language. Buddhism crossed borders, so did mathematics, so did smallpox. Merchants, monks, and explorers carried more than cargo. They carried culture. By the time of Marco Polo's travels in the 13th century, Eurasia wasn't just linked by trade. It was stitched together by human curiosity and imperial ambition. And yet, it was still mostly land-based. That was about to change. In the 15th century, globalization put on a new face, and that face had sails. Portugal led the way, then Spain followed. Their ships didn't just carry spices and explorers, they carried ambition, religion, firepower. To the monarchs of Europe, the oceans weren't obstacles, they were highways to power. The so-called Age of Discovery was, in truth, an age of conquest. When Columbus landed in the Caribbean in 1492, he didn't find a new world. He crashed into an old one and broke it open. What followed was cataclysmic. Entire civilizations were devastated. The Aztecs, once an empire of millions, fell to a few hundred Spaniards and a handful of horses, backed by guns, germs, and steel. The Inca Empire collapsed under similar weight, as European disease ravaged a population that had no immunity. The Americas weren't discovered. They were taken. Land seized, cultures erased, and people enslaved. But that was just one corner of a global triangle. Africa, too, was pulled into the current. Over 12 million Africans were kidnapped, chained, and packed into ships, often less than 18 inches of space per person. Many died before ever touching foreign soil. Those who survived the Middle Passage faced lives of forced labor in brutal conditions. This wasn't trade. It was extraction. Sugarcane plantations in the Caribbean became engines of wealth for Europe, and engines of death for the enslaved. In places like Barbados and Saint-Domingue, life expectancy for a slave was sometimes under a decade. In South America, indigenous and African laborers were forced into the silver mines of Potosi, perched in the Bolivian Andes. Millions died hauling wealth out of the earth, wealth that would fund Spanish wars, European palaces, and the rise of a global elite. Meanwhile, back in Europe, coffee, tobacco, and chocolate became luxuries. A new consumer culture was born, and few asked how these goods arrived in their cups, pipes, or kitchens. But this wasn't just about commodities, it was about systems. For the first time, labor, land, and capital were linked across continents. An enslaved child in Angola, a sugar shipment in Jamaica, a banker in Amsterdam, all part of the same chain. The world had never been so connected, or so violently unequal. This was globalization, at the end of a sword, and its scars still shape the world we live in. By the 1600s, the age of sail gave birth to something entirely new. Not just exploration, not just conquest, but corporate empire. Enter the Dutch East India Company, known as the VOC, and the British East India Company. They weren't governments, not officially, but they had the power of one. These weren't merchants, they were war machines in disguise. Armed with private navies, the right to wage war, and monopolies granted by kings, they didn't just trade goods. They seized ports, toppled rulers, levied taxes, built fortresses. They wrote the playbook for corporate globalization, centuries before Silicon Valley. The Dutch East India Company became the world's first multinational corporation. It even issued shares to the public, making it the earliest model of today's stock market. But its profits were soaked in blood. In Indonesia, the VOC ruthlessly dominated the spice trade, controlling nutmeg, cloves, and mace. On the Banda Islands, when local rulers resisted, Dutch forces massacred thousands. Survivors were enslaved to work the same spice fields their ancestors had once owned. The British East India Company followed a similar path, but on a far grander scale. It didn't just trade with India, it conquered it. Through a mix of diplomacy, betrayal, and brute force, the company slowly extended its control. By the mid-18th century, it was no longer a business. It was the de facto ruler of India, governing over 200 million people with a private army twice the size of Britain's own. And like any profit-driven entity, it extracted everything it could. Textiles, tea, opium, taxes. Indian farmers were forced to grow cash crops instead of food, leading to devastating famines, including the Great Bengal Famine of 1770, where up to 10 million people died. But the company made record profits. Later, the British would introduce railroads, not to empower India, but to move raw materials to ports faster. They built an empire of efficiency, not equality. Meanwhile, in China, when the Qing dynasty tried to resist British opium imports, the British East India Company triggered the Opium Wars, using gunboats to pry open Chinese markets for addiction. The result? A global network of exploitation, driven not by kings, but by companies. What began as commerce became colonization. What looked like trade became tyranny. And what we now call free markets were often born from gunpowder, famine, and forced labor. They didn't just globalize the economy. They globalized the idea that wealth, once justified, can be taken at any cost. 2 world wars, devastation, reconstruction, and yet, globalization didn't stop. It accelerated. War required production. Production required resources. And peace required cooperation, or at least the illusion of it. Enter the Bretton Woods system, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Suddenly, there were rules: currency stabilization, cross-border lending, trade liberalization. And just as the dust settled, a new technology emerged: the shipping container. Simple, metal, stackable. And yet, it changed everything. Goods could now move across the world at a fraction of the cost. Factories shifted overseas, supply chains sprawled, outsourcing became policy. And globalization no longer needed empires. It had corporations. Then came the internet. At first, it was a whisper, a slow dial-up connection, a blinking cursor on a glowing screen. But it didn't stay quiet for long. In just a few decades, it rewired the world. Information no longer moved by horse or telegraph. It moved at the speed of light. An idea born in Tokyo could go viral in Toronto before sunrise. A product designed in San Francisco could be manufactured in Shenzhen, marketed from India, and delivered to your doorstep in Atlanta, all without a single person ever meeting face to face. Borders didn't disappear. They became invisible. We built platforms instead of cities, networks instead of nations. Anyone, anywhere, could build an audience, start a business, share their story. But the same digital tools that connected us began to control us. Tech giants became borderless empires. They didn't need armies. Their weapons were algorithms. Their currency was attention. Click, swipe, scroll. Every action mined for data, fed into a system designed to shape not just your habits, but your worldview. Behind the convenience was something darker. Surveillance capitalism. Your life, your searches, your GPS pings, your preferences became a product. And for millions doing the labor behind the screen, there were no benefits. No minimum wage, no guarantees. Just endless gig work. 5-star ratings. Content moderation for $1 an hour. Digital factories with no walls. Globalization had entered your pocket. But so had inequality. For centuries, globalization was sold as progress. A rising tide. A tide that would lift all boats. But not all boats were built the same. And some were never meant to float. While the wealth of nations ballooned, the hidden costs were quietly absorbed by the most vulnerable. In Bangladesh, garment workers earn less than $3 a day. In buildings like Rana Plaza, which collapsed in 2013 and killed over 1,100 people. In the Congo, children dig for cobalt with bare hands. In Mexico, small farmers are crushed by cheap imports. In the US Rust Belt, factory towns fade into memory. Jobs offshored. Communities hollowed. Promises unfulfilled. Even the environment bears the weight. With oceans choked by shipping fuel, landfills overflowing with fast fashion, and air poisoned by global demand. We didn't see the cost. Because it was buried. In distance. In darkness. In silence. Then came the shocks. COVID-19. Supply chain collapses. War in Ukraine. Rising nationalism. Broken logistics. Global inflation. Suddenly the miracle of globalization looked vulnerable. Too complex. Too fragile. Too dependent on systems no one fully controls. And yet, there's no going back. Because globalization isn't a choice anymore. It's the air we breathe, the phones in our pockets, the language we speak, the food on our plates. But maybe the question isn't, should we globalize? It's, how do we globalize better, fairer, safer, slower maybe, but more human? Because the web we've woven is vast, but it's also made of people. And we get to decide what kind of world it connects us to. If this video helped you see the past more clearly, share it. Because the future of globalization won't be built by corporations. It'll be built by how we connect and who we leave out. And that story is still being written. So if you want to keep uncovering the roots behind today's biggest questions, and see how history still shapes our world, Subscribe for more stories that dig deeper than headlines. Because history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes.